Welcome to Paper Trail, where we make academic research accessible and engaging. Let's see what the evidence says.
The conventional wisdom is that central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve, act as the anchor for inflation expectations. They set policy, they communicate, and markets and the public adjust their beliefs about future prices accordingly.
And that's often seen as a critical tool, right? If the Fed can anchor expectations, it's easier to keep actual inflation in check. It's almost taken as an article of faith.
Precisely. But what if that anchoring power, or at least the direct, immediate influence, is largely an illusion? What if we've been attributing too much direct credit to the Fed for something that the market itself is often already doing?
So the paper suggests the Fed might be more of a passenger than a pilot when it comes to steering inflation expectations. That's quite a provocative claim.
It is. The researchers argue that while the Fed does matter, its direct, immediate impact on market-based inflation expectations around policy announcements is surprisingly modest. Much of what appears to be Fed influence might actually be the market moving on its own, anticipating and responding to a broader set of economic signals, independent of specific Fed pronouncements.
That's a significant reframing. If the Fed isn't the primary anchor in the way we commonly perceive, what exactly does the paper mean by the illusion of the anchor?
The illusion refers to the idea that the Fed's formal policy statements or press conferences are the primary, decisive moments that shift market expectations for inflation. The researchers highlight that market prices, particularly those derived from Treasury inflation-protected securities, or TIPS, often move before or concurrently with Fed announcements, reflecting a deeper, more continuous processing of information by market participants. It's not necessarily a direct, unilateral dictate from the Fed that then filters down.
So it's less about the Fed's pronouncements acting as a singular immediate shock and more about the market's continuous digestion of all available economic data, with the Fed's announcements being just one, sometimes less significant piece of that puzzle.
Exactly. Think of it like this. If you're watching a weather forecast and the meteorologist announces a high chance of rain for tomorrow, you might prepare. But if you've already been seeing dark clouds gathering all day, feeling the humidity rise, and hearing distant thunder, you're probably already anticipating rain. The official announcement confirms what you largely already suspected, or what the environment was already signaling. The market, in this analogy, is already seeing the clouds.
That analogy helps. So how do the researchers disentangle the Fed's actual direct impact from these broader market movements? That seems like a tricky identification problem.
It's quite clever. They focus on high-frequency movements in inflation expectations data, specifically around the precise time of Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC, announcements. They look at what happens in the minutes and hours immediately surrounding these events, comparing changes in market-based inflation expectations to movements in other key financial variables, such as interest rates and equity prices. The core idea is to isolate the announcement effect itself, distinct from the ongoing continuous information flow.
And what did that high-frequency analysis reveal about the announcement effect?
It showed that the direct, isolated impact of FOMC announcements on market-based inflation expectations is, on average, relatively small. While there are certainly instances where the Fed clearly moves markets, the overall statistical effect when you strip away other concurrent market dynamics is less pronounced than typically assumed. The paper suggests that a significant portion of what is attributed to the Fed's direct influence is actually the market responding to broader information, or even the market's own reevaluation of the Fed's likely future actions, rather than the Fed definitively setting the anchor.
So the Fed might be reacting to the same information the market is, and the market is reacting to that information, and then we see both moving and mistakenly conclude the Fed is leading the charge entirely?
That's a key insight. The paper implies a more reciprocal relationship. The market isn't just passively receiving signals, it's actively processing and often anticipating. So when the Fed makes an announcement, it might be largely validating what the market had already priced in, or it might be refining the market's interpretation of the economic outlook, rather than fundamentally shifting the long-term inflation anchor in a dramatic way.
This brings to another interesting point. If the Fed isn't the sole or primary anchor, what else is influencing these expectations? What are the other clouds in your analogy?
The paper doesn't explicitly detail every single alternative factor, but it strongly implies that broader macroeconomic conditions, supply shocks, fiscal policy decisions, and even global economic developments play a much more continuous and pervasive role in shaping inflation expectations. The market is constantly integrating all these elements. For example, a sudden surge in oil prices or a major fiscal stimulus package might have a more immediate and lasting impact on inflation expectations than a carefully worded FOMC statement that largely reaffirms an existing stance.
So the Fed is one instrument in a very large orchestra, and sometimes the other sections are playing much louder and perhaps even leading the tune than we give them credit for.
That's a good way to put it. The Fed might be the conductor, but the orchestra members, the broader market, economic data, global events, are also highly skilled and sometimes play their own variations or even anticipate the conductor's cues. The paper isn't saying the Fed is irrelevant, it's suggesting its role is more nuanced and less direct than the popular narrative often portrays. Its influence might be more about guiding expectations within a range rather than acting as a rigid, singular anchor point that completely dictates market beliefs.
This raises questions about the practical implications for monetary policy. If the Fed's direct announcement effects are limited, does that mean its communication strategy needs to change? Or is it simply a matter of understanding its true sphere of influence?
It suggests a need for central banks to be more realistic about the immediate, direct impact of their communications. While clear communication is always vital for transparency and guiding longer-term expectations, this research implies that relying solely on announcements to dramatically shift market-based expectations in the short term might be overstating their power. The Fed's influence is likely built more through consistent actions over time and its overall credibility, rather than just the words in a single statement.
So perhaps less emphasis on trying to surprise markets with a specific phrase and more on a steady, predictable course that aligns with broader economic realities.
Precisely. It reinforces the idea that central banks are most effective when their actions and communications are credible and consistent with the underlying economic fundamentals and their stated objectives. The market is sophisticated. It's not easily fooled or singularly swayed by a single press release if it contradicts other compelling data or long-term trends.
This work seems to challenge what some might call the Fed put mentality, the idea that the Fed always has the power to step in and fix things, whether it's propping up markets or taming inflation single-handedly.
It definitely provides a counterpoint to that perception. The research indicates that while the Fed is powerful, its influence isn't absolute or always direct. Markets are complex adaptive systems, incorporating a vast array of information. Attributing every market shift or every change in inflation expectations solely to the Fed's immediate actions risks oversimplifying how these expectations are actually formed and sustained.
It also seems to imply that market participants themselves play a much more active role in shaping these expectations, sometimes even leading the Fed in terms of pricing in future economic realities.
That's a crucial takeaway. The paper highlights the market's own agency. Market participants aren't just waiting for the Fed's pronouncements, they're constantly analyzing data, forming their own forecasts, and trading on those beliefs. In many instances, the market might arrive at a conclusion about future inflation or economic conditions well before, or even independently of, a formal Fed announcement. This makes the Fed's job more about navigating and responding to existing market dynamics than simply dictating them.
So it's not that the Fed doesn't matter, but rather that its influence is woven into a much richer tapestry of economic forces, and one needs to be careful not to isolate its effect too cleanly.
Exactly. The researchers aren't suggesting the Fed is irrelevant. Its long-term commitment to price stability, its credibility, and its operational tools certainly matter for the trajectory of inflation. But the direct, moment-to-moment control over market-based inflation expectations, particularly around specific announcements, might be less dominant than the popular narrative suggests. The anchor might be more widely distributed across various factors and market dynamics than we commonly assume.
This research really encourages a reconsideration of the mechanisms through which monetary policy actually impacts the economy, especially when it comes to something as crucial as inflation expectations. So, to distill this down to a few key insights for listeners, what would they be?
First, the direct, immediate impact of Federal Reserve announcements on market-based inflation expectations is often more modest than commonly believed. Second, market participants are highly active in processing broad economic information, and their expectations often move independently of or even in anticipation of Fed statements. Third, the anchor for inflation expectations is likely a more diffused concept, influenced by a wider range of macroeconomic factors, fiscal policy, and global conditions, not solely the Fed's pronouncements.
And finally, what's one big question this paper leaves one with?
It really makes one wonder. If the market is so adept at pricing in future inflation and anticipating Fed moves, how much new information is the Fed truly providing with each announcement versus simply validating or subtly adjusting what the market largely already expects?
That wraps up this episode of Paper Trail. Join us next time as we dig into more research worth talking about. If you liked what you heard, share it with a friend.
Keep reading the fine print.